The US-Israel war in Iran is hitting economies quite hard, and one of those economies is South Korea. The reason is simple. South Korea imports almost all of its energy. Roughly 94 to 98% of what it needs comes from abroad. And when it comes to crude oil, around 70% of South Korea's imports come from the Middle East. A large share of that passes through one narrow route, the Strait of Hormuz. That already makes South Korea already one of Asia's most exposed economies when conflict disrupts energy flows. But the problem now is getting bigger than oil. Until recently, the main concern was fairly straightforward. If conflict in the Middle East disrupts shipping, oil and gas prices rise, and South Korea pays more for the energy, that pushes up fuel prices, electricity costs, transport costs, and factory input costs. It feeds inflation, weakens household spending, and hits an export-driven economy that depends on competitive manufacturing. Now there is a second layer to this risk: industrial feedstocks. South Korea has resumed importing Russian naphtha, and that tells you a lot about how serious the pressure has become. This week, Seoul imported 27,000 tons of Russian naphtha, its first such purchase since the start of the war. The shipment was made possible by temporary US sanction waiver covering cargo already in transit. Why does that matter? Because naphtha is not some minor chemical input. It is the core feedstock for South Korea's petrochemical industry. And it also matters to the semiconductor production. South Korea imports about 45% of its naphtha needs, and roughly 77% of those imports usually come from the Middle East. Naphtha and its derivatives are used to make high purity chemicals, solvents, plastics, photoresists, cleaners, and insulating material that chip manufacturers depend on. So this is no longer about petrol prices or LNG cargoes. A prolonged disruption in Middle East supply chains can start hitting the materials that support South Korea's high-tech industry, including semiconductors, which sit at the center of the export economy. That is why this conflict is becoming more dangerous for Seoul. On the energy side, South Korea still has some short-term protection. The government has strategic petroleum reserves that cover about 200 to 208 days of demand. It has already released part of those stockpiles, including more than 22 million barrels, to ease pressures. LNG reserves are already seen as sufficient for a limited period, even if supplies from countries like Qatar are disrupted. But these are buffers, not solutions. The economic transmission is already underway. Higher oil prices mean higher fuel and electricity costs. Those costs move through transport, logistics, petrochemicals, steel, and manufacturing more broadly. In South Korea, where exports are driven by energy-intensive sectors, that matters a lot. A 10% rise in oil prices can significantly raise production costs, with petrochemicals taking one of the biggest hits. That squeezes margins, weakens competitiveness, and puts more pressure on exporters already dealing with softer global environment. At the same time, inflation rises. That creates a difficult policy problem for the Bank of Korea. If prices are rising because of imported energy stocks, but growth is slowing at the same time, the central bank has fewer easy choices. That is why officials are increasingly worried about stagflation-style squeeze, higher prices, weaker growth, and less room to respond. Financial markets are already reacting that way. The KOSPI has seen sharp losses. The won has weakened significantly against the dollar, bond yields have risen, and foreign investors have been pulling money out, reflecting the view that South Korea is especially vulnerable because of its dependence on imported energy and trade-sensitive manufacturing. That reaction is not just about fear. It reflects South Korea's structure. That is a country that depends heavily on imported oil, imported LNG, imported petrochemical inputs, and global integrated supply chain. So when the Middle East becomes unstable, investors see a direct line from the Gulf to Korean inflation, Korean factory costs, Korean exports, and Korean growth. The government is now trying to manage it in several ways. One is direct price support. Seoul has imposed a cap on gasoline and diesel prices, the first such move in nearly 3 decades, and is reviewing it regularly. Fuel taxes are also being considered. Another is fiscal support. The government has prepared a large supplementary budget to cushion households and businesses. and says it could scale market stabilization support much further if needed. Then, there are supply side measures. South Korea is securing extra crude from the UAE, looking for more non-Middle Eastern imports. It is also restarting nuclear reactors ahead of schedule and keeping coal-fired power available as a backup if LNG supplies tighten. The logic here is straightforward. Even though oil itself plays a smaller role in electricity generation, freeing up gas and stabilizing the power system helps the broader economy. Longer term, Seoul is trying to reduce this vulnerability altogether. That means more LNG from the United States and Australia, more investment in renewables, more nuclear generation, and more infrastructure that can bypass choke points like Hormuz. But that transition takes time. And right now, fossil fuels still dominate South Korea's energy mix. Gas remains critical for power generation, and Middle Eastern volumes remain attractive because they are efficient, accessible, and deeply embedded in the system. So the bigger picture is this. South Korea is not just dealing with an oil shock. It is dealing with a wider supply chain shock. Oil is under pressure, LNG is under pressure, and naphtha is under pressure too. That matters because South Korea's economy is built on exactly the sectors that suffer most when energy becomes expensive and industrial inputs become uncertain. So when people ask how the Middle East conflict is hitting South Korea, the answer is not just at the petrol pump. It is in inflation, it is in factory costs, it is in the won, it is in investor confidence, and now potentially it is in the materials that help power the country's chip industry. For more such explainers, subscribe to DawnNews English.